Tonight we are so honored to have her share her work with us. Please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Rima Brucey.
Thank you, Cara. Can you all hear me? I have like 3 microphones on, I think. Yes. Okay, so now it is my pleasure to introduce so let's see how this goes. So, first of all, how many here are students? Nice. That's very nice. That's great even, because you know what? This lecture, good or bad or whatever you think it is, it was written for you. There could be 2 of you here. It would still be for you. It is, I hope, a small, humble contribution to your process. What process, you ask? Well, the one where you start or get ready or continue to chart your own path, to blaze your own trail. And my colleagues, where are they? Faculty and staff, thank you so much for being here in spite of the snow that was so awful. I thought nobody was going to make it. Please know that I know you have 1,000 things to do, and that I really, really appreciate your presence. There's lots to say, so let's just get started. I'm going to start by saying that my childhood, between the ages of 0 and 10, or 9 or 10, was, I'm going to use the word intense, I think. Meaning, I did not go to school much, not really. I skipped half of 3rd grade and the entirety of 4th grade, for example. Never went. We lived in a car for a while. I had only 1 book that I read and read and read and read. Food was scarce, not to be taken for granted. Shady characters came and went, you know. The kind of situation where strange adults may come one day and remove you. That's the language of these things, right? Remove you. And indeed, they did come and remove me. I only remember vaguely their feet. 2 of them, white sneakers. That was a bit heavy. let me go back and say 3 things, less heavy ones, quickly. 1, I will talk about a particular topic, education, yes I will, and about a category of activity, academic. But I will try to use more storytelling than data. You'll see some of that, but I hope you find more meaning than knowledge. I don't know if I'm making much sense. Because the data, you know, I can give you later, or you can find yourself. But the stories, no, those you'll get the old-fashioned way. Plus, we can talk about the educational research and data during the Q&A at the end. 2, there's a few characters in these stories that I'll tell you. But the main characters, I would say, include my grandfather, Abuelo Juan, and Benito Martinez Ocasio, also known as Bad Bunny. Yes, you'll get my story with Bad Bunny. And 3, that no worries, that bit about the childhood before, that's it. That's all the drama you're going to get today. You know. And it's there because it's context. I need it for context. Context, that is, for the actual start of the story. And this start involves me, age 9 or 10, a bit feral, with a head so infested with lice that my poor grandmother, who was the most proper, bashful woman in the universe, had to suppress a little scream and clutch some imaginary pearls when she first saw me. You see, I was moving to my paternal grandparents' home, where I stayed for the next 5 years, the longest I had lived anywhere. Their place had an actual bathroom. The bathroom had a toilet. I had my own bedroom. The bedroom had a door. There was furniture in the house, and my grandparents had routines. They cooked and sat down to eat at least 2 times a day, sometimes 3, for example. We always had food in the fridge. Abuela drove me to school. I had a backpack, shoes for school, and get these, separate shoes for home. You know, the works. I was living the life. It was, of course, a perfectly normal middle-class home. But to me, this new living situation was actually full of potential adventure for 2 reasons. One, that place was full of books. No, you don't understand what I mean. Like really, way beyond what you would expect in a perfectly normal 80s home. Let me describe it to you. There were shelves from floor to ceiling in all the walls of the largest room in the house, my abuelo's studio. But each shelf had 2 rows of books. So every book actually had 1 or more behind it, like a little mystery, multiplied hundreds of times. In that same room, that was the studio. Then there were books on shelves on the walls in what had been my father's bedroom when he was little. And in that same room, there were books inside the closet. Like, when I say inside the closet, I mean like on the shelf that goes here, but also piled in between, and then the boxes, it was optimized, the space. Yeah. In that same room, there were then books not only in the closet, but also in trunks under the bed. And yes, also on the bed itself, in piles. There were books in the guest room, that poor little tiny guest room, completely overwhelmed with shelves and piles and boxes. All the shelves looked like this. It had a small bedroom, the guest room, with a shower that nobody could use for showering because guess what? More books. I sometimes wondered why we kept calling it the guest room. No guest could ever fit in there, regardless of their size. You could invite Tom Bellina to stay over. It wouldn't have worked. Then there were the boxes and boxes and boxes and boxes of books in the garage. Not because they were going to be given away, which is usually the reason for books to end in the garage, but because they didn't fit in the house. I did find The Count of Monte Cristo for the first time in one of those garage boxes. Oh, that was nice. I never saw the actual car, though, in the garage. It didn't fit, even though it was a 2-car garage. But, Then, I'm forgetting important books here, there were the dictionaries. Remember, 79, 80 hours was the paper world. No Googling things, You needed dictionaries. And these dictionaries were like really big and heavy and important looking. One for Spanish, La Real Academia Española. It was cream colored, and it sat on its own elegant lectern like some medieval illuminated book. And one for English. I think it was Oxford. I cannot swear it, but I'm pretty sure it was Oxford. It was blue. It was sitting on a regular shelf, that one. No lectern. We can talk about my grandparents' motivations for the different arrangements for the dictionaries later. Now, we did have a polilla problem. Polillas are very small moths. So many books were, yes, full of little holes. And some of those holes were cascading towards the edge of the page. So sometimes reading necessitated some imagination because words were missing, so you had to sort of make things up. But also read fast because the book could, be gone any second. In sum, books were disintegrating. There was no order whatsoever, alphabetical or any other kind. It was all a mystery. They were hidden, or at least hard to find. So yes, I knew I had years of adventure ahead of me. An adventure complete with treasures and mazes and villains, those will be the polillas, and secret spots and plots. That was the first thing, the weirdly abundance the books. The second was, of course, el abuelo, my grandfather himself, mi abuelo Juan. Every day, aside from eating and showering, this is what he did. He read for hours. He thought for hours. I mean, sitting there, thinking, looking into the distance, sometimes mumbling a little, gesturing towards an imaginary audience, and very often doing this with his hands. That's the thinking. And occasionally he would move to his desk and write something. Once a day, late afternoon, usually before dinner, probably because he was hungry, he gave a hug and a kiss to my abuela, and a pat on the head and a silly joke for me. Other than that, his life was mainly reading, thinking, and sometimes writing. Once a week, he would walk to the post office, often to send letters to senators and other U.S. elected officials, including the President of the United States. Now, what my grandfather was remained a mystery for a while. I just knew he was retired, whatever that meant. My abuela, my grandma, explained that abuelo had this thing called a PhD. A what? A PhD in history. A doctorate, Rima. Also, is he a doctor? No, Rimita, he's a historian. You know, many of you here have been through this kind of exchange. Right? We know how this works. And I did get it after a few rounds. I'm not that tense. He was like nobody I ever met. Some family members actually made fun of him behind his back. They called him things like un vago bien alimentado, a well-fed bum, a well-fed lazy person. But to me, abuelo, he was awesome. He was the happiest person I had ever seen. I wanted to be like him and would sometimes, you know, very secretly, very quietly, just sound it out in my head. PhD. PhD. He must have noticed I was searching and reading because he started to leave books on my nightstand. But if I asked about a meaning, a date, an epoch, whatever, there was no help. They, the two of them, they just pointed to the lectern, to which they had, very considerate, added a little step so that I could reach and read the dictionary myself. The same kind of step, years later, I put next to the toilet so my toddlers could reach during their potty training. So, lots of books that had no context, no lesson plan, no particular order, no sense of geography or what the original language or historical context were, but those were, or that was, I am convinced to this day, my beautiful, messy education. Those old books were my school, and I would not be standing here without them. And when I say without them, I don't mean just the books. It's also the weirdo grandparents. Gracias, viejo. Gracias, vieja. I can't remember all the books, too many of them. Some of them, I have to say, I skimmed more than read, because I found them boring or more embarrassingly, and more often because I didn't understand them. Dante's Paradise, for example, I could not finish. And I could not finish, it's a euphemism, because really my starting wasn't that great either. Sorry, literature folks, about Dante's Paradise. You do have to admit that it's the worst of the three. I mean, we can agree on that, right? Yeah, and I did read Inferno, and it was good. I was a dark child. Anyway, other books, though, I read many times, and some were a true revelation. One short story by Julio Cortázar, and I was so hooked I couldn't sleep. I spent weeks, day and night, reading everything we had by him, which was quite a bit, reading and reading and reading, and after a few weeks, I had fallen in love with him. Julio Cortázar, age 65. The man who could think and write like that. Now, I learned not to mention these things at school much, though, because my peers were of the opinion that you were supposed to fall in love with somebody in Menudo or something. Somebody like Ricky Martin, not some Argentinian middle-aged writer with a big beard. So I kept it to myself, my romance. When Abuelo suddenly started giving me books in English, though, I panicked. I said, no. We're not going there. So he gave me a Time magazine instead. It's just a magazine, he insisted, while he followed me around the house. And I shrieked that I didn't understand a single word. And then he pointed to a little table, and sure enough, there was the Oxford. No longer on the shelf, now on its own table, no lectern, but still moving up. Okay, so that process was slower, but it worked. And I'm so glad it did. It gave me great gifts. It gave me Jane Eyre, Little Women, Wuthering Heights, and above all, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And later, it gave me Melville's Moby Dick. I couldn't really speak the language, but I could read it. It was a new power. It was a superpower that would come in handy later in life. Now, I have a confession. I knew I wanted to share some of the ways I have engaged with the topic of educational inequality with you, but before I had the narrative, I needed a title badly, because Cara and Robert, and this was their idea, were asking, Cara, Robert, you're amazing and I love you, but yeah, they kept asking for a title. And then my husband and I happened to see a T-shirt. Good scholarly research, huh? We happened to see a T-shirt from the Honors College, not a poem, not an essay, T-shirt. It had a motto. It said, life is short, think hard. That was cool, I thought. Life is short, think hard, which immediately brought to my mind the phrase, the life of the mind. And one of the many books in my abuelo's house had that title, of course. And then it brought me the image of my abuelo himself, sitting in his favorite chair, a book on his lap, thinking. And yes, I used the word thinking there very intentionally. If he had to choose, he would have chosen thinking over knowledge every day. Anyway, after picturing my abuelo thinking, I naturally thought and wondered about my own mind. Now I have the PhD. Is my mind like his? I mean, I wanted to be like him, but you see, my mind isn't exactly un remanso de paz, a haven of tranquility. I mean, it's not a bad mind. It's a nice enough mind. It's not an ugly mind or anything. But it's less like a haven of peace and more like, here we go, a family of kangaroos. Kangaroos. Family, kangaroos. They're called a mob, actually, kangaroo families. I didn't know that, but yes, they are. You have these kangaroos, and they're enclosed in a very small space that I guess would be my cranium, and inevitably, accidentally, and occasionally, they do hit each other, you know, because they have the big feet, plus those tails, and all the jumping, and this habit of carrying two babies at the same time. But also accidentally and occasionally, these kangaroos, they may actually do something graceful or even smart. I'd like to think that anyway. I don't think my abuelo, though, had any kangaroos in his mind. didn't look the type. So, for chronology, very quickly, I left my grandparents' house in 10th grade. I lived elsewhere for a little bit of time. I left that elsewhere and dropped out of high school Hear me out, no drama, it'll get better in a second. Dropped out of high school in the 11th grade. I know, just wait. Got myself a very boring retail job from which I was promptly fired for, and I'm quoting the manager, lack of enthusiasm. I got another less boring job at an attorney's office. I took the GED, I took the SAT, and I went to a public college near me, a good quality state college at an affordable price. Sounds familiar? Was important. Anyway, after that, after college, I went to grad school in New York. I got the magical PhD and came back to work as a lecturer and then assistant professor at my undergraduate alma mater. And there I did the things newbies do, teach the classes nobody wants, and I happen to write articles based on my dissertation, like that too. Turn your dissertation into a book, not so sure about that, because you see, the kangaroos. The kangaroos, here's what happened. I was thinking about my topic, space and place, one day. And I wondered if the students that lived at walking distance from campus actually applied and enrolled. I wondered, in other words, about the relationship between space, place, and what I would later learn to call access to higher education. I had a colleague, an engineer, who happened to be working at the institutional research office at the time. I asked him. He checked numbers. No, they were not coming. Even worse, he told me. He had been following admission numbers for a particular group of students, the students that lived in the public housing projects next to our campus, and they were super low. Oh, you want to work together? Yes, let's work together. Because of the focus on space, we got another colleague, a third one, Walter. And Walter was an expert on GIS and maps, and he was also really smart. We told him what we had. Want to work together? Yes, let's work together. So there you go. That's how mixed methods happen. When you hear the phrase mixed methods, it's usually something like that. So my job in this team was to read a lot, think a lot, and write white papers and proposals. David did IPEDS deep dives. Walter performed some ArcGIS magic. We combined the numbers of institutional research with the ones on the census for our baseline to see where we were starting from. We looked at the town where our campus was and then found out that at the time, 12% of the households were located in a housing project. 13% of the people under 18 lived in a housing project. And yet, between 1990 and 2006, 16-year span, only 0.3% of the enrolled students came from the projects. So we clearly had a population that was underserved and underrepresented. You see, kangaroos, sometimes they do the right thing. So these were potential students and their families living the closest to the university. And yet they had the lowest numbers for educational attainment in town. The very dark red, to give you a sense, is between 60 and 80% no high school diploma. So the lowest educational attainment in town. And they lived right next to us. They could walk to campus in 5 or 10 minutes. And what does it mean then, we thought, to be a public university if you're surrounded by people who can't get a high school diploma? We got funding for 1 year, then 5 years. This was the concept very quickly because we're going to run out of time. We wanted to do a center that did these three things: research, outreach, action. Each of these activities would shape the others, influence the others, and in turn be shaped by them. Their relationship, we believed, made the model stronger. Research referred to all the things we did to better understand the why and the how of the low access, and included qualitative, quantitative, and mixed methods. Outreach included activities that brought students closer to the university. These activities were informed by evidence-based practices and also by research findings, including participatory action research carried out by the college students from the projects that were enrolled at the moment in the school. And finally, action included all those things we needed to do to change the social or institutional conditions that reproduce the inequality we were observing. Advocacy, op-eds, course redesign, training for faculty and staff, etc. There were jobs for assistants, and the students from public, housing, and low income had priority to apply for those jobs, which is a form of action in and of itself, since on-campus jobs tend to be associated with improved retention outcomes, as opposed to off-campus jobs. So, I mean, there's so much. It was 3 years. There's a lot of research and stuff. I wanted to mention, in particular, our research with institutions, the way we realized that the institutions may be best understood in terms of the students' lived experience. And when you looked at them that way, you could think in terms of practices, what people do, structures, the way things are organized in offices, departments, and so forth, policy, the things that are written down, the rules, and finally, and my favorite, because I'm an anthropologist, institutional culture, which refers to the shared understandings, the things people think, the things a lot of people think, and even when they don't realize it, can easily turn into practice, can easily turn into policy. So, a quick example from schools, because I did ethnography of institutions, not only in our college, but also in local schools. One example from schools was the idea, shared by many, that public housing students were not college material, and that people like me were giving them false hopes. Right? This false hope thing, and they were like, their heart broke for the false hopes that, that we were giving them. So what they did was things like, for example, if there was a workshop about college going, there will be a workshop at the same hour about domestic violence. And guess which one were our students sent to? They were seen as domestic violence potential perpetrators, not as college-going material, right? So that kind of thing happened a lot, and happened to people with good intentions, which is the interesting part about this institutional culture thing. Culture is about daily life. At the end of the day, the question that every educational institution needs to think about is to look at daily life and ask, in what we do every day, are we creating a pathway for a student to go to higher ed or to be successful, or away from higher ed and away from success? What are institutions doing? And what can institutions do? And that became sort of the guiding question for the project for 3 years. So really fast, lots of outreach stuff. We did tutoring, where we actually, instead of going to the schools around, we brought them to the university, much more complicated and expensive, but it actually got them in the university until they were comfortable. They knew where things were. They knew how to ask for something, right? They knew which office was what and did what, right? They were comfortable in the space of the university. And afterwards, we dropped them off in their house. This is one of the projects, Ruben. We had Saturday activities where they came and did something around a particular discipline. So that something was simultaneously like a fun activity, but also like an introduction to what, in this case, a chemist would do, right? We did field trips. In this case, for example, they examined 7 ecosystems, visited each one of them. They were all very close to one another. It was a great day. And we did summer camps. This is the group in our first summer camp. I know, it's a small group. It took us a while to get trust, right? This is the first group. We got the funding in April, had the summer camp in June. This is our summer camp in June. in 2008, and then this is 2009. There were 146 by then. The ones in the photo are only the summer camp participants. There were many participants that had to skip the summer camp for other reasons. I had to leave the island in 2010 before we could measure certain critical indicators, like graduation rates, because it had been only 3 years. We needed 6, pretty much, usually, right? But they couldn't wait, so they measured at 5. And at year 5, these were the numbers. Remember, this is an area where 60% of people do not have a high school diploma. Also remember the QA, the center, we did not have any requirement, just attendance. We didn't care about grades. You could flunk and repeat your grade. We didn't care, come back. It was not about that. Also remember that in years before, we had 0.3% admissions in 16 years. After 5 years of the QA, 98% of the students graduated from high school. 92 went to college. 92% went to college. This is higher than the rate that any other group in the institution. Those who went to college, 45 went to the University of Puerto Rico, which is not only the state university, it was also the best university at the time, and also the most prestigious and most selective. And of those 45% that went to the UPR, and I love this, 79% went to our school. Our school, one of the top 2 most selective institutions in the system and in Puerto Rico, and the flagship STEM campus. Right? They came. And this was, I mean, I know you know this, but there was no special admissions. They had to take the SAT like everybody else, same formula like everybody else, no difference, except that they have been doing this for 5 years. Right? They have been doing the QA and going to the university, and I'm convinced that being in the space was half the battle. Just having them come and be in the space and meet professors and things like that. People with PhDs. So in the US, I first worked not with a university, but with an organization, a nonprofit, equal parts advocacy, research, and communications, that had the singular goal of improving equity and fighting inequality in education from preschool through college. The Education Trust in Washington, D.C. I learned a lot. They assigned me, they must have seen the kangaroos, because they assigned me 50% to communications and 50% to research. With my research hat, I studied public universities in the US that had done a good job increasing graduation rates for underrepresented students. Communications hat, I studied issues of access in schools and colleges, and sometimes, often went out in the world looking for stories that illustrated those issues. I wrote, for example, about DACA and Dreamers, about the importance of rigorous coursework, about how parents can find critical information about their school or communicate with their teachers. I wrote about these and other topics twice a week. We published the stories in English, and Univision published them in Spanish. I did everything was the same, like this education thing. I did some guesting, talking with Univision and with radio, some training with, for example, the National PTA, but it was all about the same value. It was all about access. So I'd like to think that together, the QA and EdTrust helped me refine my understanding of access, those 5 years. I've studied many things in my life, but I think this one, access to higher education, has been kind of a constant. And this slide reflects this understanding of access. I want to think of access in a way that takes into account student experience and daily life, their pathway, but also the elements of institutions that I mentioned before, practice, policy, culture, and structure. But although we do tend to treat access like a singular moment, either they go to college or they don't, right? The truth is it's more complicated than that, much more rich and complex. Oh, and shout out to Yesenia, my assistant over there, who turned a very ugly bullet list into this beauty. We're not going to go over the whole thing, but I want to call your attention to, there's access right there. What does it mean? Does it mean that you apply or that you get admission? No, it first means you develop college-going aspirations. That's part of the path. And science suggests, and evidence suggests, that if you don't develop these aspirations in middle school, your odds are low of going to college. Then you need the preparation, right? So that you can have the right coursework, for example. Then you need to navigate the application process. Then you need to apply, right? And once you apply, you're still thinking about the money. And in order to think about the money, it's useful to know the difference between the sticker price and the net price, for example. And many students don't know that, and they just run away as soon as they see that number in the website, right? You need to fill out the FAFSA. The FAFSA has improved a lot, but still, it's a thing, right? You have to be aware of other forms of aid. If you get admitted, you have to decide how many credits you take, right? And you have to stay. There's retention right there. And it says some things about retention here: belonging, engagement, academics, financial issues. All of those things play a role in retention. Also, if you take a loan, you have to know that not all loans are created equal. If you take a job, not all jobs are created equal. If you graduate, when you graduate, then you have to think, right? Is my degree good for what? Access to what? Do I have the skills and the learning and achievement that I need to have in order to get the job that I want? Can I get and be gainfully employed, meaning that I can not only feed myself and have a roof over my head, but also pay any debt that I might have? Things like that. All of it is access. It's part of it. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that minds that move are necessarily better. That's not the argument. On the contrary, some minds that I know, and some minds in general, can stay put on a topic and achieve extraordinary depths of understanding or create unique works of art. Those minds are often the ones that win Nobel Prizes and stuff. That's the way they're built, and we need them. But other minds just have to move, man. They have to move. The mind on the move in the title moved in rather modest ways. It changed topics, methods, and skills to better follow a question, because this mind happens to think that the question should determine and drive the method, not the other way around. It went from academia to the nonprofit world and back, and it loved writing and happily added advocacy-oriented, journalistic, and eventually creative writing to the more traditionally academic stuff. But to close this talk and to push the idea of mind on the move a little further, I want to tell you one last story. In 2017, I was part of the Center for Human Rights and Peace Studies in the Bronx. Long and dense story short, here are some of the few things, here's a few of the things that Puerto Ricans had to deal with between 2017 and 2019. 2 hurricanes that caused over 4,000 deaths, because both FEMA and the local government were ineffective and neglectful. Almost half the public university's budget, talk about access, was cut off. The tuition increased threefold. Over 400 public schools were closed without an explanation. By now, that's closer to 700. And you can imagine the impact that closing a third of the schools and taking away a half of the university's budget has on access for the most vulnerable student populations. Tons of stuff. The power utility, for example, was privatized, but the service got worse and more expensive. Most deaths after hurricanes in Puerto Rico are related, in fact, to lack of electricity. So power really is a matter of life or death. This is just a small sample of the many austerity measures, privatization, and erosion of essential services that Puerto Ricans were dealing with in 2019. Context, again. And then, in 2019, the chat came out. The governor, Ricky Rosselló, had a group chat with his closest advisors. The chat showed evidence of illegal activity, discussed plans to manipulate public opinion, made abundant sexual, misogynistic, and homophobic jokes, and even made fun of the victims of Hurricane Maria. Yes, the governor and his friends made fun of 4,000 dead people, and this came to light. Now, Puerto Ricans had had enough, and they took to the streets daily in protest. Now, Puerto Ricans also have a reputation for the most creative protests. I think it's true. People protested in kayaks. People protested while praying. Tons of protests featured different kinds of music. Clowns, performance artists, ballet, lots of dancing in general. But some events, though, the ones in Old San Juan in particular, started getting dangerous. The protesters were loud but unarmed and peaceful. Nevertheless, the riot police, at 11 p.m., this is bizarre, under the euphemism crowd dispersion, tear-gassed and attacked the protesters with batons and rubber bullets, while announcing over loudspeakers, and I quote, "Your event is no longer protected by the Constitution." So everybody started saying, oh, so at 11 the Constitution goes to sleep. Sure enough, next day, university students are in front of the Capitol in the stairs with a new protest modality that consisted on lovingly reading bedtime stories to the Constitution before placing it in its crib at 11 p.m. on the dot. Now, my way of coping was writing op-eds, articles, pieces designed for visibility, presentations or ghostwriting or translating, a bit of TV and radio. I wrote in both languages. When they closed schools, for example, my friends and I wrote about that. Again, we were going for visibility. The budget cuts to the public university hurt access. So I did research, and we wrote several pieces, including this one about that. The for-profit education sector, backed by private equity firms, was growing at the expense of the public university. So yes, wrote about that. And one night, in July 2019, the police again puts the Constitution to sleep and attacks university students unarmed, doing nothing except yelling at them with tear gas and rubber bullets at very close range, which can do a lot of damage. I wrote about that one, that incident for the nation, trying to get some visibility outside the island for the clear human rights violations, but also the connections between the human rights violations on the one hand and what was happening to Puerto Rico's institutions, right? And that was fine. But at that point, I had started to have the feeling that the moment required something different. I did send a piece to the nation and then paid close attention to social media. No organization seemed to be organizing, and yet everyone seemed to be getting ready for something. Puerto Rican artists of international fame, like Ricky Martin, Residente, and Bad Bunny, were indignant, tweeting all over the place, and rumors said they might be going to the island. I started getting like anonymous invitations. Usually I don't pay attention to those, but there was a different quality to these. These were different. I asked a journalist friend of mine, look, are these serious? And he said, well, I think most are, it's hard to tell, but I don't know about you, but I'm going, he says. The hashtag Ricky renuncia, meaning the governor, asking the governor to resign, was really trending. And then I'm thinking these thoughts, a voice behind me, baby, do you prefer window or aisle? It was my favorite voice. It was my husband's voice, helping me and my mind and its kangaroos get on the plane. Later he told me that I had been sitting there and reading and thinking and mumbling and doing this for about 10 hours. So I left the next day. The first day I was there, I attended protests. There were so many. So I chose to attend the ones organized by teachers and university professors and students. Here's one of them. And we could feel it. People were in this strange and heightened emotional state. Some place where anger kind of encounters joy and they actually get along. That's where we were. Also, there were horses. Yes, people protested on horseback. That was a thing that same night. They changed the name of the street. This was La Calle Fortaleza, and now it's La Calle de la Resistencia, and nobody has dared change the name back ever since. It stayed Resistencia ever since to this day. It's another one, university professors, and Spider-Man. Spider-Man was everywhere. I don't understand how he did it, because he was here, and he was in New York, and he was in all the protests at the same time. Go figure. Some of my lawyer friends who were into human rights too had read the Nation article and suggested that I join them the next day for the big protest, we were hoping was a big protest, as a human rights observer. And they said, sure, that makes sense. And the next day, thousands of people indeed did show up in the early hours for what came known as the Ricky Renuncia March. And more kept coming. And more kept coming. It was happening. And yes, Ricky Martin, Residente, and Bad Bunny, all of them came, all three of them. There they are. This photo credit should go to CBS. I didn't put it there. So they were on a truck at the end of the line formed by the marching crowd. So there was the crowd you saw, then like a long, long, long line, and then the truck with these three on it. I went with my friend Isar, who's also an anthropologist, to get instructions. And I think I said something rather solemn, like, I work at the Center for Human Rights, blah, 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 and observer, blah, blah. And the guy looked at me for a couple of seconds and then asked, what can you do? Pardon me? ¿Qué tú sabes hacer? What are your skills? Well, I can think and write, sometimes if I'm inspired, and teach, but only some things, not all of the things. And he took me out of my misery, wrote something down, and called his friend, Gerardo, llévate estas dos para el comité de seguridad. Take these two to the security committee. And I was like, wait, what? The security committee? What are we going to do there? Well, we need more protection for Ricky, Residente, and Bad Bunny, he explained. Because the fans get excited, and they will try to climb to the truck with them, and it's not safe for them. And I was thinking, it's not safe for me. So I answered, oh, yes, oh, well, As tempting and important as that job sounds, I'd like to call your attention to the fact that I'm 50, that I cannot see without my glasses, like at all, blind as a bat, and I don't really work out. So, out of shape, and my friend here is a little bit stronger, but she's like 5 feet tall. Now it was his turn to be solemn. Bienvenidas al Comité de Seguridad. Welcome to the Security Committee. And soon enough, there we were, protecting. It was actually, I admit, a good system, because the artists only had 3 real bodyguards, right? And the crowd by then was already estimated to be around 500,000. The muscular professional bodyguards were on the truck to intervene if needed, while me and about 100 others were more about prevention. We walked arm in arm, like links in a chain, in a circle around the truck, a human shield, right? The fans turned out to be lively, but not violent. Although, yes, some did try to get through, and yes, we did have some bruises the next day, lots of bruises. And also this young woman kept yelling, Bad Bunny, te amo, right in my ear. Bad Bunny, I love you, so often and so loudly, and the next day I still had the ringing. And this other guy, for some bizarre reason, kept trying to stand on my shoulders behind me, and he was trying, climb. It's very, very strange. That said, we did have a privileged view. It wasn't easy with the arm-in-arm thing on my old little phone, but I did try to take some photos because I secretly hoped my children would find me cool. So this is not CBS. This is me. That's where I was. I was next to them. I was closest to the Bad Bunny side. That was my spot. Residente had been in more protests in Puerto Rico and elsewhere. Bad Bunny was much younger. Bad Bunny was born in '94. Residente and Ricky Martin are closer to my age, so very early 70s. But Bad Bunny was already making cultural and political statements using his clothes or his production decisions. This was, however, his first major openly political protest, I believe. He had interrupted a big tour to be there. Both him and Residente seemed to defer a lot to Ricky Martin that day, and it made sense. So here's Ricky Martin over there, talking to David Becknott from CBS. Over here, David Becknott, Ricky Martin, right? So all the journalists and everybody who needed to make decisions had to consult with Ricky. He was like in charge. And I don't know, I thought it was really cute. The fact that they would get along with that and make that kind of arrangement. Because you see, here's the thing. The chat, the governor's chat, had a lot of homophobic expressions, including especially against Ricky Martin, who's gay, who came out at a time where it was harder to do so, and who took a lot of criticism when he did. So when Ricky Martin, I'm standing right there, and he takes out the rainbow flag, and then he brings the rainbow flag and puts it together with the Puerto Rico flag and starts moving it, and people start yelling, and people are so happy. It was so beautiful. It was so beautiful. People were cheering, and I knew I was witnessing history and cultural change, that I was part of a moment, and I teared up a little in spite of the weirdo behind me who has seemingly decided that he was definitely going to climb on my shoulders. Anyway, I have a very short video of the three of them. You want to see it? Okay. I told you, always music. Oh, at the end, try to listen to what the guy in the gray shirt says. That guy.
Se rompió la cadena aquí con él. Este es mira, el weakest link.
Yeah, I know, you couldn't hear it. It was like, Sula, but what he's saying is, ya encontramos por dónde se rompió la cadena. El weakest link. You see, as it turns out, our chain, our circular chain, had a little bit of a hole that he was pointing at on that side, and he was saying that he had found the weakest link. I'm happy to report I was on this side, and proudly, can say that I was not the weakest link, in spite of, whatever. So, how many people? Is the question I get asked most often, or one of them. The most commonly used number is 500,000, but the actual number is closer to 1 million. Once you add the side streets, the marches in other towns of the island, and the marches in places in the diaspora, like New York City. My friend Disa and I will treasure the memory of the day we were Bad Bunny's bodyguards. And you know what? No. Bodyguards, without the... We were bodyguards. We were even more than that, because we protected the artists and also protected, with our middle-aged bodies, the actual bodyguards who weren't even walking. So there. The governor did resign. Was getting rid of the governor enough? No, but it was a big, big win in more than one way. It was not a win achieved with the tools of the law. or knowledge or force. No. It was about bringing a million bodies together. Sounds simple, but it's tricky. Because while an individual body doesn't make much of a difference, and an individual person might think they don't need me, we need many of those individual bodies for this particular move to work, and this was the only move that was going to get the governor out. Think about it. It's almost like a miracle. All those bodies there, without clear leadership, organized organically, without political party signs or symbols. Nobody was doing that. Only Puerto Rico flags. The police, when they learned what was going to happen, they threatened to not go and not protect anybody, just to punish us. They didn't go, no violence, nothing, not one incident, with 500,000 people. That day was a rare show of the power of the people who were going through so much. And it was frankly a relief, a respite, and I'm convinced of this, a success in and of itself, regardless of the final outcome. We did it. I forgot to mention something earlier about a book, my abuelo's house. The Hannah Arendt one. The one we borrowed the title from after we saw that t-shirt, The Life of the Mind. Well, like most of the books at my grandparents' house, this edition was in Spanish. So here's a Spanish title for The Life of the Mind. La vida del espíritu. The life of the spirit. And there's, of course, practical, simple reasons for that choice. In German, the word for spirit can mean a number of things, including mind. In Spanish, espíritu also can have multiple meanings. It can mean soul, for example, or intellect, or grace. It can also refer more colloquially to an entity that possesses consciousness, but not a body, like a ghost, or an espíritu. Mi abuelo, Juan Luis Bruce Muñoz, PhD, died at the age of 94, shortly after my family and I had moved to DC. And the day he passed, he was reading The Economist and thinking. Here he is giving a 10-minute toast at our wedding. He was 85 years old there. He not only wrote the speech, he memorized it carefully. He had no notes, no nothing. He just did it. And the rhythm, and the sentences, and the quotes. That speech was beautiful, perfect. 85. So, the mind on the move of our story changed topics, methods, and knowledge, moved from academia to the nonprofit world and back, added advocacy-oriented, journalistic, and creative writing to her academic writing, and you just heard the fourth move. It has to do with activism, which I've been involved with since I was a student, but more than that, with the mind, in the sense we have been using the word here. I watched my island's crisis from afar and did a lot of, reading and thinking and writing, and that was good and we needed that, and yet thinking tends to happen in solitude. Thinking is also about meaning. Sometimes meaning-making has to be a collective act. And when that happens, the life of the mind may actually be about putting down the pen, getting off your butt, and putting your body where your mind is. Yes, you're tired, unimportant, out of shape, an anonymous body, just like everybody else's, even if someone is yelling in your ear, and even if you get some bruises. Thank you.